02:41 a.m., May 30th. A Russian ground crew logs another quiet night at a coastal airfield. Nobody on that base believes the aircraft parked outside are worth defending. They are wrong. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a machine most people have never heard of, a flying antenna built to talk to nuclear submarines hiding under the Arctic ice, ended up parked 1,000 kilometers from where it was supposed to be. You'll know why the Russian Navy's entire submarine communication doctrine may have to change because of what happened on this apron. And you'll know the one detail buried in the satellite pass 2 days later that told analysts this wasn't a lucky hit, it was a target list built weeks in advance. To understand why this strike matters, you have to understand what a Tu-142 actually is and why it's not where you'd expect to find it. The Tu-142 is a maritime cousin of the Tu-95 Bear bomber. Same contra-rotating propellers, same Cold War-era airframe, but a completely different job. Most Tu-142s hunt submarines. One rare variant does something stranger. It talks to them. The Tu-142MR, NATO reporting name Bear J, trails a very low-frequency antenna wire behind it, sometimes kilometers long, that can punch a signal through seawater to a ballistic missile submarine running silent deep below the surface. It is, in effect, a flying node in Russia's nuclear command chain. Lose the aircraft, and for a window of time, Moscow loses one of its ways of reaching a boat it can't otherwise talk to. These aircraft are supposed to live at Kipelovo, a Northern Fleet airbase tucked into Vologda Oblast, hundreds of kilometers from anything resembling a front line. It's the kind of posting that, on paper, should be untouchable, deep in Russian territory, far from Ukrainian drone range, home to a program that even carries the base's own name, the Kipelovo Modernization Initiative, an effort to keep this aging fleet compatible with Russia's newer generation of submarines. But on the night this story is about, the Tu-142s weren't at Kipelovo at all. They were 1,300 kilometers south, sitting on the tarmac at Taganrog Yuzhny, an airfield run by the Beriev Aircraft Company on the Sea of Azov coast, the same firm that originally built the Tu-142 decades ago, and the only one with the specialized tooling to keep it flying. Two of these aircraft had been there for a very long time, not weeks, not months. Norwegian air power analyst Lars Peder Haga would later suggest the airframes were likely midway through deep repairs and modernization, possibly even approaching test flights, after reportedly sitting in that maintenance queue for over a decade. Here's the emotional whiplash of that fact. An aircraft built to protect Russia's most sensitive nuclear assets had spent 10+ years grounded, vulnerable, waiting its turn, parked in the open, at a facility the Russian military may have assumed was simply too far from the war to matter. That assumption was the first domino. Ukraine's answer to that assumption came from its Unmanned Systems Forces, a branch built specifically around one problem. How do you reach targets Russia considers safe? Their long-range strike drones don't need runways, don't need to survive air defense in the conventional sense, and don't need to be fast. They need to be patient, low observable, and precisely targeted. And in the weeks before this strike, Taganrog had already become a name analysts were watching, a recurring target in Ukraine's deep strike campaign, hit days earlier when drones struck a sanctioned aircraft repair plant in the same city tied to maintaining Russia's military aviation fleet. So when the first drone crossed into Taganrog airspace in the early hours of May 30th, it wasn't improvising. It was finishing something that had already started. This is where most coverage of this story stops. A drone hit a plane, here's the footage, moving on. But that framing misses almost everything that actually happened between detection and impact. It misses why this specific airfield was chosen over dozens of others hosting Russian aircraft. It misses the layered defense, or lack of it, that let multiple drones operate over the same target in sequence.
and it misses the detail in the aftermath that turned this from an aircraft was damaged into Russia may need to rethink where it hides its most sensitive assets.
We're going to walk through all of it, minute by minute, decision by decision. Here's what most after-action summaries leave out. This wasn't a single drone against a single target. It was a coordinated raid against 3 separate high-value assets on the same stretch of tarmac, executed by Ukraine's first separate center of unmanned systems. And at least one of those targets wasn't an aircraft at all. Before the drones reached the apron, one aircraft on that field had already been sitting motionless for longer than some of the operators flying the mission had been alive. Let's rebuild the target itself, because the what matters as much as the how. 2 Tu-142s sat at Taganrog that night. One was a Tu-142MK, an anti-submarine warfare variant designated in Russian records simply as Black 71. The second was the Tu-142MR, the Bear J, the submarine communications aircraft. Both had reportedly been decommissioned or in long-term storage, no longer active with Russia's aerospace forces, according to reporting that emerged after the strike. That detail matters because it complicates the story in an honest way. These weren't front-line combat aircraft scrambling to intercept anything. They were, in a sense, already halfway to being museum pieces, which raises the real question analysts have been arguing about since. Was this strike about removing an active capability, or about denying Russia the ability to ever bring that capability back? The answer depends entirely on how rare the Tu-142MR actually is, and it is very rare.
Pyotr Butowski, author of Russian Air Power and one of the most cited voices on Russian military aviation, was among the first to identify the destroyed aircraft as the MR variant, picking it out by a distinctive forward-pointing pod on the tail fin, replacing the rearward magnetometer seen on standard anti-submarine Bears. By Butowski's estimate, somewhere between 12 and 14 Tu-142MR airframes exist in the entire Russian inventory, split between 2 units, one at Kipelovo with the Northern Fleet, one at Mongokto with the Pacific Fleet. There is no active production line. Nobody is building more of these. Every one that's lost is a permanent subtraction from a number that was already small enough to count on your fingers. That's the first countermeasure defeated, not a physical defense, but an assumption. Russia assumed obscurity was protection, a rare aircraft hidden inside a maintenance backlog at a facility far from the front, surely not worth the drone inventory it would take to find and hit it. Ukraine's targeting process said otherwise. The second layer was geography itself, 1,300 kilometers of Russian airspace between the front line and the target. For years, that distance functioned as a de facto defense system. It didn't require radar or interceptors. It simply assumed no drone could survive that flight. That assumption had already been cracking for months. An April strike earlier this year against an airbase in Chelyabinsk region, roughly 1,700 kilometers from the border, had damaged 4 aircraft, including 2 Su-57 stealth fighters and an Su-34 fighter bomber. Taganrog wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, and the pattern was distance is no longer defense.
Here's the technical aside worth pausing on. Why does a slow, propeller-driven strike drone succeed against a target this far inland when faster systems get intercepted closer to the front? Part of the answer is exactly because it's slow and low signature. A small, quiet aircraft flying a long, indirect route below the coverage envelope of point defense radar optimized to catch fast, low-altitude cruise missiles or artillery range threats. Deep strike drones aren't trying to punch through a wall, they're going around it through gaps in a detection net that was built for a different kind of war. At approximately 4:41 a.m. local time, the first drone reached the apron. Footage, later released by Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, shows a drone descending into the wing of one of the Tu-142s, striking near the fuel tank. Fire followed almost immediately, the kind of fire that, on an aircraft with structural fuel storage inside the wing, doesn't stay contained to one section for long. A second drone found its mark on the other airframe minutes later, and a third target, sitting elsewhere on the field, took a hit as well, an Iskander operational tactical missile launcher, the same mobile system Russia has used to fire ballistic and cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities. 3 high-value targets, 1 raid, 1 continuous window of vulnerability that Russian air defense at Taganrog apparently never closed. There's a small human detail worth sitting with here. Somewhere on that base, in the minutes after the first impact, someone had to be the person who radioed it in, who had to explain to a chain of command that believed this facility was untouchable that it wasn't anymore. We don't have that transcript. What we do have is what happened next, conflicting claims. A Russian military blogger operating under the name Fighter Bomber put out his own account, claiming the damaged airframes included a Tu-142MK and a separate Tu-142MR that had been transferred in from the Northern Fleet, a detail that, if accurate, would mean the aircraft lost wasn't simply an old airframe waiting for restoration, but one still tied to an active fleet unit. The fog around exactly which aircraft burned that night hasn't fully cleared. What has become undeniable is the number: 2 Tu-142s, destroyed or damaged beyond immediate recovery, confirmed independently days later. The confirmation didn't come from either side's press release, it came from space. 2 days after the strike, on June 1st, commercial satellite imagery captured the airfield in daylight. Independent aviation analysis group, AviVector, published the pass, and it settled the argument that Telegram channels and military bloggers had been having in the dark. The imagery showed Taganrog Yuzhny hosting 4 Tu-142 airframes in total, 2 intact, decommissioned aircraft sitting untouched, and 2 others, unmistakably burned out, reduced to blackened structural skeletons on the apron where they'd been parked for years. One confirmed as Tu-142MK Black 71. The other confirmed through the wreckage's tail structure as the rare Tu-142MR. USF Commander Robert Magyar Bravdy announced the results personally, releasing combat surveillance footage documenting the terminal impacts on all 3 targets, both aircraft and the Iskander launcher, and framing it as a coordinated success by drones under the first separate center of unmanned systems. For a war increasingly measured in exactly this kind of exchange, cheap, long-range drones against expensive, hard-to-replace legacy hardware, the math was brutal for Russia. No active Tu-142 production line exists anywhere. Every airframe lost doesn't get replaced, it gets subtracted permanently from a fleet that was already down to a number analysts count in the low dozens.
And the strategic sting wasn't really about the 2 aircraft that burned, it was about the ones that didn't, because now Russia has to ask whether anywhere is far enough. Taganrog was chosen by Russian planners specifically because it sat outside what anyone assumed was drone range. That assumption is now retired, along with the aircraft. The Northern Fleet's remaining Tu-142MRs at Kipelovo, the ones that dropped off satellite trackers over the past year in favor of the more northern Severomansk 1 airfield near Murmansk, are now flying with the knowledge that far from the front no longer means safe. That's the loop this video promised to close. How the jamming, or in this case, the absence of any effective point defense, was defeated by distance and patience rather than brute force. Why a decade-old maintenance backlog turned 2 aircraft into sitting targets instead of a temporary inconvenience. And the detail in that June 1st satellite pass that changed the calculation. Proof that Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces aren't just hitting what's close, they're reaching for what's rare, what's irreplaceable, and what the other side assumed was untouchable. So here's the question this strike actually leaves hanging. If a facility 1,300 kilometers from the front line isn't safe anymore, what does Russia's dispersal strategy look like from here? and how much of its remaining strategic aviation fleet is currently sitting in the open, betting on distance that no longer holds. Drop your read on that in the comments. I want to know where you think the next target on this list is. If you want to understand how this kind of deep strike campaign actually gets built, how Ukraine picks targets like this one weeks in advance, and how it's slowly rewriting the range assumptions the entire Russian air defense doctrine was built on, the next video breaks down the operation that hit Russian stealth fighters 1,700 kilometers from the border, and the gap in radar coverage that made it possible. That's next.